In the great sprawl of the Roman Republic, and later the Empire, not all men were born equal. Some were born into privilege and inheritance, while others were claimed by fate and iron. From the farthest provinces to the heart of Italia, the forces that brought men to the arena were as varied as the bloodlines of Rome itself. A gladiator's story often began not in glory, but in defeat, in war, in debt, in shame, or in betrayal. Many began as prisoners of war, when Rome conquered distant lands, from Gaul to Dacia, from Numidia to Britannia. It captured not only territory, but people, shackled and marched to distant markets. These men, once warriors of their own tribes, were paraded through streets as trophies before being auctioned like livestock. Buyers would gather in the forums or slave markets, inspecting muscles, teeth, and scars, speaking in tongues the captives could not understand. And among the crowd, perhaps in the shadow of a wealthy senator's villa, stood the lanista, a gladiator trainer and dealer. He looked not for obedience or meekness, but for rage, fire, the raw instincts of survival. He sought those who had not been broken. Others arrived by chains for different reasons. Criminals, condemned by the courts of Rome for theft, murder, or treason, found themselves sentenced ad ludum to the school of gladiators. Unlike the foreign slave, the Roman criminal knew what awaited him: the sharp steel of spectacle, the roar of the crowd, and the grim chance of redemption through blood. Still others were debtors who could not repay what they owed. Desperation drove some to sell their freedom in exchange for coin or security for their families. To volunteer for the games was unthinkable to most, yet some Roman citizens, drawn by the promise of fame, gold, or perhaps a sense of purpose, took the oath willingly. This oath, once uttered, changed everything. The man became property. He swore to endure branding, binding, flogging, and death by the sword. It was not a mere contract. It was a surrender of the self. No longer a man of Rome, he became a man of the arena, a tool of the crowd's pleasure. He was no longer his own. Names were often stripped from the condemned, replaced by nicknames, titles, or labels reflecting their origin or weapon class. A man from Thrace might be called simply Thrax, while a former fisherman might become Retiarius, the net wielder. Each name was a role to play, a mask for the stage of the sand. In the arena, identity was both erased and forged anew. The lanista was both master and merchant. Often a former gladiator himself, he understood the brutality required to break a man in, and the patience needed to make him shine before the masses. To him, each recruit was an investment. Some were destined to die in training. Others might one day command cheers in the Colosseum. The best were worth a fortune, their survival, a dividend, their deaths, losses to be written off with a sigh. Rome itself fed on these stories. Children played mock battles in courtyards, pretending to be the famed heroes of the arena. Merchants sold oil flasks bearing the faces of victorious gladiators. Women adorned their walls with painted likenesses of the most handsome fighters. Even the elite whispered rumors of affairs with these men of sweat and steel. Behind each roar of the crowd stood a silent truth, that every gladiator had a beginning not of choice, but of circumstance, and that, once chosen, there was no turning back. The journey from slave market to ludus was neither short nor merciful. Once purchased, The recruits were herded into caravans or chained in small groups and marched toward their new home, the Gladiator school. These schools, scattered across the empire, stood like fortified barracks on the edges of cities. From Capua to Pompeii, from Carnuntum to Rome itself, the ludi were places of both discipline and transformation. For many, their arrival was under cover of night. The streets would be quiet, the townsfolk asleep, as the new bodies were led through the gates of the school, surrounded by thick stone walls and iron bars. There was no ceremony. A wooden tablet bearing the name of the lanista hung above the gate, a grim reminder of the owner of their fate. Inside, torchlight flickered across sweat-soaked training yards and shadowy cells. The air smelled of oil, blood, and rusted iron. For the new arrivals, the arena was no longer a distant rumor. It was their horizon. The first few days were always the same. Bodies were counted, examined, branded. Each man was evaluated not as a person, but as a resource. Were his arms strong? Was his back straight? Had he fought before? Could he endure pain? Medical slaves would treat wounds not out of kindness, but out of economy. A healthy gladiator was worth more than a broken one. Old scars were mapped like roads on a map, each telling a story of survival or suffering. They were then assigned quarters, stone cells shared by 2 or more men. Within those cold walls, alliances were forged or enemies made. Language was often a barrier. Many came from distant provinces and could not understand one another. Yet, in silence, camaraderie still formed. The man who shared his ration of beans, the one who helped bind a wound, the one who didn't flinch when the guards beat them. These gestures grew into bonds, and in time, into brotherhood. Once the evaluations were complete, the men were summoned to the training yard. It was a vast, open space, packed earth, surrounded by columns and bordered with wooden dummies and racks of weapons. Here, they met the doctores, the veteran trainers who would shape them. Clad in tunics and armed with wooden canes, the doctores were feared more than the lanista himself. Many had once stood in the arena and survived. They knew what it took not only to fight, but to entertain, and they would settle for nothing less than perfection. The first lesson was always the same: movement. Before a man could hold a sword, he had to learn to stand, to step, to pivot. They walked in circles for hours, shields tied to their arms, weights strapped to their legs. Any misstep was met with a sharp strike across the back. Day after day, they repeated the same footwork: forward, turn, retreat, duck. It was exhausting, but slowly, like sculptors chipping away at stone, the trainers shaped fighters from slaves. They were not yet gladiators. They were novici, new men, trainees. Until they proved themselves in the prima rudis, their first spar, they were considered unworthy of armor or true weapons. Their swords were wooden, their helmets made of leather, but the pain was real. Broken ribs, shattered noses, dislocated joints, all common, and no one cried. To weep was to mark oneself as weak, and weakness had no place in the arena. Each morning began with the sound of the bell. At dawn, they assembled in the yard for drills. Morning routines involved stretching, running laps, and strength training using sacks of sand or wooden logs. Then came the weapon sessions. Each man was matched with a partner of similar size and skill. They would spar for hours under the gaze of the doctors, who shouted corrections and punished laziness without hesitation. Evenings brought study. Yes, study. For gladiators were not mere brutes. They had to learn the roles they would play in the arena. Each weapon class had its own traditions, stance, and style. The retiarius, light, agile, and armed with a net and trident, relied on speed and deception. The secutor, heavy, with a large shield and helmet, was trained to endure and overpower. The thraex, the mamillo, the hoplomachus, each was taught not only how to kill, but how to perform. They were drilled to remember choreography, anticipate counters, and read an opponent's rhythm. Each move was designed not only for victory, but for spectacle. It was not enough to survive. One had to entertain, to capture the gaze of the crowd, to inspire cheers and coins. Because in the arena, survival meant little without fame. But the road to that fame was long, and for most, it ended in a pool of sand and blood. As the weeks dragged into months, the brutal regimen of the ludus began to mold the men into warriors. Muscles thickened, reflexes sharpened, and instincts once dulled by fear turned razor-sharp with repetition. But not all who arrived survived this transformation. The weak, the defiant, the unlucky, they were weeded out. Some fell to injury, others to illness. A few tried to escape, only to be captured and punished before their fellow trainees as a warning. Discipline was absolute, and the arena demanded no less. Within this closed world, every man was eventually assigned a gladiator class. These classifications were not arbitrary. They were crafted to ensure balance and entertainment. The Romans admired variety in their blood sport, and the lanista took great care in sculpting each fighter's role. To be a mamillo was to carry the weight of tradition, heavy armor, a straight gladius, and a broad rectangular shield called a scutum. The mamillo evoked the image of the Roman legionary, and thus carried with him the pride of the empire. His counterpart was often the thraex, or Thracian. Light and nimble, the thraex wielded a curved sword known as a sica, and carried a small square shield. His armor was ornate, with a crested helmet adorned with feathers or animal motifs designed to dazzle the crowd. The contrast between the brute strength of the mamillo and the agile cunning of the thraex created tension in every clash, a living chessboard of muscle and steel. Then came the retiarius, the most unorthodox of them all. He fought with no helmet, only a padded arm guard and shoulder piece. His weapons were a fisherman's tools, a net, a trident, and a dagger. Scorned by some as unmanly and praised by others as brave, the retiarius had to rely on speed and wit. He danced across the sand, casting his net in arcs of calculated risk, thrusting with his trident, always aiming to entangle and strike before his heavier opponent could close the distance. Opposite him stood the secutor, the chaser, whose smooth helmet was designed specifically to prevent the retiarius net from catching. With small eye holes and a rounded, featureless dome, it gave the secutor a terrifying presence. He bore a short sword and shield like the mamillo, but moved with a singular purpose: to hunt, to close the gap, to corner and kill. Other classes existed as well, each with their own flair. The hoplomachus, resembling a Greek hoplite, bore a spear and round shield. The Dimachus fought with two swords, a blur of twin blades. The eques entered the arena on horseback, only to dismount and finish the fight on foot. Each type represented a different archetype: the brute, the trickster, the duelist, the hunter, and together they brought a mythic depth to the combats. The games became more than sport. They became theatre, allegory, a living myth told through flesh and sand. With class came uniform. Armor was carefully fitted and often personalized. Bronze greaves protected the shins, leather baldricks crossed the chest, and helmets were adorned with plumes, crests, and engravings. Before matches, fighters were polished and oiled, their muscles gleaming under the Mediterranean sun. They were not just killers, they were art. Yet beyond the weapons and the armor, it was the mindset that set gladiators apart. In the ludus, men learned to discard hesitation, to strike first, to think with their limbs, to read every twitch in an opponent's eyes. Pain became a language, a lesson, a partner. They learned to ignore the sting of shallow cuts, to fight through fatigue, to keep moving even as blood slicked their grip. A true gladiator didn't just endure, he performed. And performance was everything, because soon the sand would not be training ground, but stage. The crowd would be vast, the cheers deafening, the emperors would watch, and for some, fame would come like a thunderclap. For others, silence would follow, broken only by the sound of a body falling to the earth. Daily life in the ludus followed a rhythm both grueling and strangely sacred. It began at dawn, when the first light of the sun spilled across the high stone walls, and torches were extinguished one by one. A great iron bell rang out, its deep tones echoing through the stone corridors, rousing the gladiators from sleep. There was no room for slowness. The moment the bell tolled, the day belonged to the discipline of the body and to the will of the doctors. The first order of the day was cleansing. Each man made his way to the communal washing area, where cold water was ladled from clay jars into stone basins. There was no luxury, only the necessity of hygiene in close quarters. Sores and cuts were inspected, and if infection had set in, the gladiator was taken aside for rudimentary treatment. It was common for the school to employ one or two medici, doctors or healers, often slaves themselves. Dressed wounds, set bones, and administered herbal poultices. Painkillers were crude but effective. Poppy extract, wine steeped with herbs, and occasionally powdered minerals mixed with honey. After washing came the first meal. It was simple, but carefully designed to fuel the heavy toll of the day. Gladiators consumed a high-energy diet, rich in carbohydrates and calcium. A thick porridge of barley or wheat, sometimes mixed with lentils or beans, was the staple. This earned them the nickname hordeari, or barley men. Occasionally, cheese, olives, or dried figs were added. Meat was rare, reserved for the more senior or successful fighters. More often, animal fat was boiled down and stirred into the gruel to provide calories and maintain weight. Salt was essential, not just for flavor, but for replacing what was lost through sweat. There was also a curious supplement, charred bones ground into powder. Rich in calcium, this bone ash was consumed to strengthen the fighters' skeletons, ensuring their bodies could withstand the brutal impact of combat. The mixture was often stirred into their barley gruel or diluted in sour wine, and while the taste was loathed, the result was unmistakable. Thick-boned, heavily muscled men whose strength was legendary. Following the meal came the day's training. The early morning hours were dedicated to drills. With the sun still low, the yard came alive with motion, pairs of men circling each other in measured patterns, others swinging weights made of lead, still others practicing strikes against wooden poles called palus. These poles were meant to represent an opponent, and the gladiators would strike them again and again with wooden swords until their hands blistered and the air grew thick with dust. As the sun rose higher, the pace intensified. By midday, sweat slicked every surface, and groans of effort mixed with the barked commands of the trainers. Footwork was refined with endless repetition. Timing and distance were drilled through mock combat scenarios. Occasionally, to simulate real danger, dulled iron weapons were introduced. Even these could cut deep if wielded carelessly, and many bore the scars of training accidents as permanent reminders of past missteps. Training ended with sparring, a test not just of skill, but of nerves. Fights were observed closely by the lanista, who took notes on each man's performance. Those who showed skill, bravery, and crowd-pleasing flair were noted for future appearances. Those who hesitated, who flinched or cowered or turned their back, were disciplined. Not always with beatings. Sometimes humiliation was enough, forced to clean latrines or eat apart from the others. Respect in the ludus was earned daily and always in blood. After the peak of training, the gladiators rested. The midday break was a sacred silence, a time for healing. They would retreat to their quarters, where they wrapped their injuries, stretched aching limbs, and lay flat on stone beds. Sometimes they shared stories of families left behind, of battles fought before their capture, of dreams too dangerous to say aloud. Other times, silence reigned, broken only by the wind rustling through the lattice of the roof or the clink of a spoon against a bowl. In the late afternoon, lighter activities resumed. Weapons were cleaned and polished. Leather gear was oiled. Helmets were checked for cracks. Each man was responsible for his own arms and armor, though some had assistants, often younger slaves, future trainees themselves, who helped with the maintenance. These tasks were not trivial. A cracked greave or frayed strap could mean death in the arena. As dusk approached, the second and final meal of the day was served. Again, it was heavy in grains, with warm wine to numb the day's aches. Occasionally, the lanista would allow a treat, a sliver of meat, a sweet cake, or a boiled egg, as a reward for those who had impressed. In rare cases, visiting patrons or magistrates would sponsor a meal, offering the fighters something finer as part of pre-game festivities. These were seen as omens of glory, and a gladiator who received special food was considered marked by fate. Night brought both rest and reflection. The school grew quiet as the stars emerged. Some men prayed to household gods they had crafted from clay or stone. Others whispered to Mars, to Fortuna, or to Nemesis. Superstition ran deep among gladiators. Talismans were worn on chains, and bones or teeth were kept in leather pouches as good luck. Dreams were taken seriously, and omens discussed in hushed voices. The death of a rat, a crow circling overhead, a dream of falling. All could be taken as signs of what was to come. Then came sleep, not always deep, not always peaceful. The air was thick with the breath of many men, with the occasional cough, sigh, or muttered curse. And in the dark, each man lay with the knowledge that soon, very soon, he would be called to step into the arena, to face another man, steel drawn under the eyes of thousands, to kill or to die, to earn glory or to be forgotten in the sand. In the solitude of the cell and the noise of the training yard, Something unexpected often grew among the gladiators, a fierce and complex sense of brotherhood. Though they had come from different corners of the empire, spoke different tongues, worshipped different gods, and wore different scars, they shared the same daily suffering, the same looming horizon of combat and death. And from that shared destiny came bonds stronger than chains. Trust was not given lightly. At first, each man was alone, watching, testing, learning who might steal his ration or betray him during training. But over time, as bruises were shared, as backs were guarded, as meals were split in silence, friendships emerged. Not just friendships, but kinships forged by sweat and pain. Men who once saw each other as rivals began to lean on one another in the long hours before dawn. A Mamillo from Hispania might teach a Retiarius from Syria how to clean his wounds with vinegar and moss. A veteran Hoplomachus might pass down tricks he learned in the arena, how to fake exhaustion, how to bait a shield drop, how to look into a man's eyes and know if he feared death that day. There were quarrels too. Fights broke out in the cells. Pride clashed with pride. But even those conflicts followed an unspoken law. We are brothers in arms until the day one of us must die. Gladiators knew that fate could pair them in the arena, no matter how close they had grown. And when that day came, friendship was set aside for duty. Not hatred, not betrayal. Duty. A strange and painful kind of honor. And yet, in the precious moments outside the arena, those bonds were everything. When one man fell in combat, the others mourned him. They etched his name into the walls of the ludus with pieces of bone or flint. They drank to his memory with stolen wine. Some kept locks of hair from the fallen, wrapped in linen, as silent reminders. And if a man died without kin, his brothers ensured he was not buried nameless. They gave what little they had to pay for a proper funeral, sometimes even pooling winnings to erect a stone marker. The bonds extended beyond mere friendship. There were lovers among the gladiators as well, men who found comfort in the quiet dark of their cells, who shared more than rations and battle strategies. Rome, for all its rigid laws, held complex and often contradictory views on love between men. In the ludus, such relationships were often tolerated, sometimes even protected, provided they didn't disrupt the discipline of the school. In the eyes of the lanista, what mattered was performance. Affection was acceptable so long as it did not soften a man's will to fight. But not all relationships were with fellow fighters. Gladiators, despite their lowly legal status, held an erotic and mythic power over Roman society. They were both reviled and adored, property of the state, but objects of lust and fascination. Wealthy women, especially those of the upper class, were known to seek the company of famous gladiators. They visited the ludi under the pretense of charity or religious rites, but often left with flushed cheeks and hidden notes pressed into hands calloused by war. Affairs were common, though dangerous. Roman husbands, especially those with political ambitions, were quick to punish wives caught consorting with gladiators, and yet the allure persisted. These men, covered in scars and the perfume of death, represented something forbidden and raw. Their power was not political, but physical. Their fame not built on wealth, but survival. For some women, that was irresistible. Some gladiators fell in love with these women. Some even fathered children. These children, often born in secret and raised in silence, carried the blood of the arena in their veins. And sometimes, years later, They returned to the very sands that had once claimed their fathers. Bloodlines in Rome were complex. Honor did not always pass through legitimate channels. Stories were passed among gladiators of sons who watched their fathers die from the stands, never knowing whose blood they cheered. As fame grew, so too did the pressure. A successful gladiator was a household name. His face might be painted on the walls of bathhouses, carved into oil flasks, or etched onto lamps. Children mimicked his style in the streets. Vendors sold trinkets bearing his likeness. Women whispered his name in the dark. Fame was intoxicating and dangerous. The more a man was adored, the greater the expectations. Every match became a spectacle, every failure a humiliation, and gladiators felt it. They walked with the weight of those expectations. Some embraced it, growing arrogant, making demands of their lanista, walking with heads high and chests puffed. Others retreated inward, overwhelmed by the gaze of thousands who would cheer their death. With the same passion, they cheered their victory. Fame offered gifts, better food, better bedding, even better chances at freedom. But it came at the cost of peace. And always there was fear, not just of death, but of obscurity, to die and be forgotten, to fall in the sand without anyone remembering your name. That was the true horror. And so they fought harder. They trained longer. They stared at their reflections in the polished bronze and whispered their names like prayers. Because for the gladiator, memory was immortality. Long before the roar of the crowd or the clash of steel, there was silence, sacred, heavy, and intimate, the silence of preparation. A gladiator's entrance into the arena was not merely an act of stepping onto sand. It was a rite of passage, a ritual steeped in fear, reverence, superstition, and performance. And like all sacred things in Rome, it began with omens. In the hours before a fight, the ludus would be tense. The chosen men, marked for combat that day, were excused from training. They awoke not to drills, but to the watchful eyes of their doctors and the slow, purposeful pace of ceremony. Each man was allowed to pray, to eat lightly, and to reflect. They were cleaned, not scrubbed like property, but polished like weapons. Their skin was oiled to glisten in the sun, their weapons sharpened, their armor fitted with precision and care. For in a few hours they would stand before thousands not as slaves, but as avatars of Roman might. Before any step toward the arena, the gladiator consulted his gods. Some prayed to Mars, the god of war, for strength. Others invoked Nemesis, the goddess of retribution, to punish their enemies. A few whispered to obscure household deities carried with them from distant provinces, deities of rivers, hills, wolves, or stars. Superstitions abounded. Some tied cords of red wool around their wrists. Others refused to speak a word until they stepped into the arena. Some made sacrifices, a sliver of meat left on a stone, a splash of wine poured out on the ground. Dreams from the night before were interpreted with obsessive care. If a man dreamt of fire, it was good luck, passion, victory. If he dreamt of drowning, it was death. A raven seen on the way to the arena was bad fortune. A white dog was protection. Gladiators did not take chances. If the signs were wrong, they carried them like weights on their soul, walking to battle already half defeated. When the time came, the arena called like a heartbeat in the distance. Chariots, carts, or foot escorts arrived at the ludus. Guards lined the streets to clear the way. Children lined the roads, shouting the names of their favorite fighters. Vendors pushed carts of roasted chickpeas and figs, preparing for the crowd. The air in Rome, on the day of a gladiatorial match, was different, festive, tense, almost electric. The Colosseum itself loomed above all, a mountain of marble and shadow. Its towering arches, blood-washed sands, and tiered seats could hold over 50,000 people. For the gladiator, it was both stage and tomb. Beneath the arena floor, deep in the hypogum, a maze of tunnels and chambers held animals, performers, and the waiting fighters. It was here, in the dark, that they waited. The cheers above sounded distant, like waves crashing against stone. Some prayed again. Others sat in silence. A few wept, not loudly, but quietly, their tears falling into calloused palms. And then came the call. A procession was formed. Musicians played flutes and horns. Heralds announced the names of the day's combatants. The doors of the hypogum opened with the groan of ancient iron. The sun poured in, brilliant, blinding, golden. The gladiators walked forward, through the tunnel, into the light. The crowd erupted. Cheers, jeers, laughter, applause. Banners waved. Flowers fell like rain. The air was hot and thick with expectation. The fighters lined up before the imperial box, where the editor of the games, often a senator, sometimes even the emperor himself, sat in marble splendor. And then came the words that etched themselves into Roman legend. Ave, Imperator, morituri te salutant. Hail, Emperor, those who are about to die salute you. It was not always spoken, not by everyone, but when it was, it turned the moment into ritual, into theatre, into myth. The match order was announced. Pairs were called forward. Opponents were named. Some matches were to the first blood, others to submission. A few, the ones the crowd demanded most, were sine missione, without mercy. Fights to the death. The air shimmered with dust and noise. The sand, raked smooth just moments before, would soon be wet with sweat and blood. Each gladiator stepped into the center, lifted his weapon, and saluted the crowd. Then the match began. The clash of metal rang out, sharp and sudden. The crowd roared. Every movement mattered, not just to win, but to impress. A slow kill, a dramatic feint, a spectacular fall. These brought applause, coins, fame. The crowd was not passive. It was part of the combat. They shouted advice, insulted cowards, praised courage. And the fighters played to them, eyes flicking toward the stands, even as swords arced through the air. When one fighter fell, the moment froze. The victor stood over the defeated. The crowd erupted in debate. Cries of "Mitte," "Let him go," clashed with shouts of "Jugula," "Kill him." The editor looked to the people, gauged their mood, and then he raised his thumb. Thumb up, down, sideways. Despite modern myths, the gestures were not consistent. Sometimes a thumb up meant death, sometimes mercy. What mattered was the editor's will and the roar of the crowd. If mercy was granted, the victor helped his opponent to his feet. If not, he stepped forward and ended it, quickly, cleanly, with a sword through the throat or heart. The dead were dragged from the sand by slaves in masks, their blood covered with fresh sand, the arena readied for the next match. And so it went, match after match, death after death, until the final fight. The crowd exhausted, the sand red and golden, the sun beginning to sink behind the arches. And the survivors, they returned to the hippodrome, some limping, some triumphant, all silent. The adrenaline faded, the cheers turned distant again. The pain returned, sharp, immediate. Medics waited, so did the doctors. And in the dark, subterranean world, men wept, laughed, vomited, collapsed. Some would live to fight another day. Others had become legends. But all had walked the edge of death and come back, for now. Victory in the arena was unlike victory anywhere else in Rome. It was not just triumph over an opponent. It was triumph over death itself. To win meant more than survival. It meant ascendance. A victorious gladiator did not return to his cell the same man. He returned transformed, lauded, bruised, blood-stained, but touched by something divine in the eyes of the crowd. For that brief moment, he stood above even senators. He had spilled blood for the Roman people, and they, in return, gave him something rarer than coin or wine. They gave him immortality. The procession back through the tunnels was quiet. There was no need for words. The victorious bore their wounds like medals. For those who had killed, there was a strange silence. Not grief, nor guilt, but a solemn weight. Some looked at their hands, still trembling with bloodlust. Others whispered prayers to their gods, thanking them, begging them, promising them offerings they would never be able to afford. The dead were gone. The living must continue. Back at the ludus, the Lanista awaited. He watched each man carefully, noting who returned, who limped, who was carried. He did not speak unless needed. A nod here, a command there. The medicus took over. Wounds were cleaned, sometimes without mercy, the raw flesh scrubbed with vinegar-soaked cloth. Broken bones were set. Gashes were stitched with coarse thread. Blood was everywhere, on hands, on floors, on the edges of wooden tables. But no one cried out. Pain was part of the ceremony now. And then came the reward. For victory, a gladiator might receive a crown of palm leaves, a palma, symbol of triumph. He might also be given coins, tossed by spectators or formally awarded by the editor of the games. These coins were not enough to buy freedom outright, but over time, with enough victories, a fighter could accumulate wealth. With wealth came privilege, better food, a private cell, time with companions, fewer duties around the ludus, and, most coveted of all, the possibility of rudis. The rudis was not merely a wooden sword. It was a symbol of release, a mark of honor. To be granted, the rudis meant a man had fought so well, so often, so nobly, that he was no longer seen as a slave. He had earned his liberty with his blood. The ceremony of granting the rudis was rare, solemn, and deeply emotional. The editor of the games would present it publicly in the arena. The crowd would cheer, and the freed gladiator, now a rudiarius, would bow, not as property, but as a man. But freedom brought its own challenges. Some rudiarii stayed with the ludus, taking up the role of doctori, training the next generation. Their experience made them invaluable. Others left, tried to live as free men. They bought land, opened taverns, or married women who once threw roses at their feet. Yet freedom was never clean. Many bore the stigma of their past. They were admired, yes, but never truly accepted. They were not Roman citizens. They were former slaves, tools of entertainment, and in the eyes of some, tainted. Some chose to fight again, even after earning freedom, not for obligation, but for love of the crowd. The arena had become home. The roar of thousands, the sun on their shoulders, the dance of blade against blade. It had given their life meaning. These men, now fighting as free agents, were both celebrated and pitied. They were no longer bound by law, only by desire. Fame, too, was a double-edged sword. Some gladiators became legends, their names painted across walls, their faces chiseled into statuettes. Lovers begged to touch their scars. Poets wrote verses about them. But fame faded quickly in Rome. A man adored one day could be forgotten the next. And when age slowed the hand, when wounds healed crooked, when the cheers became less thunderous, the once great fighter was often left behind. Some grew bitter, some drank, some tried to teach, but could not tame the younger men. Some returned to the arena one final time, hoping to reclaim what had slipped away, and fell silently, their names already fading as the next match began. But others found peace. In the hills beyond the city, in quiet villages, in homes filled with children who would never see an arena. They told their stories slowly, around fires, the scars on their bodies, marking the chapters of their life. They taught their sons to farm, to read, to live without blood. And in old age, they looked back, not with regret, but with awe. For they had done what few men ever dared. They had stared into death's eyes and made it blink. Beyond the sand, beyond the roar, beyond the dripping edge of the gladius, the gladiator existed as something far greater than just a warrior. He was not only a killer or a slave. He was a symbol of Rome's might, of its contradictions, of its hunger for beauty wrapped in brutality. And it was this symbolic weight that gave the gladiator a place in nearly every layer of Roman life, in religion, in politics, and even in the very soul of Roman identity. To understand this, one must first look at the rituals of blood that long preceded the games. Before gladiators were ever thrust into the Colosseum for sport, Rome held sacred rites known as munera, offerings to the dead. These began as private ceremonies where wealthy families honored their ancestors by organizing combats near their tombs. The blood spilled in these rites was thought to appease the spirits, to feed them, to show honor through sacrifice. There was a time when death in the arena was not spectacle, but sacred offering. As Rome evolved, so too did its rituals. The munera became public, the combats grander, the blood no longer for the dead alone, but for the living masses. And the gladiator, once a mere part of a funeral rite, was transformed into a civic tool, a means of shaping public mood, expressing power, and controlling the narrative of the empire. Politicians understood this deeply. Aediles and emperors alike used gladiatorial games to curry favor with the people. They funded grand spectacles from their own pockets, or from the coffers of the state, knowing that the public's love could be bought not with bread alone, but with blood. The phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, was not metaphor. It was strategy. A fed and entertained people were less likely to revolt, less likely to question the corruption within the marble walls of the Senate. Emperors, too, played this game. Julius Caesar famously held games that stretched for days, flooding arenas with water for naval battles, importing wild animals from the edges of the known world. Titus inaugurated the Colosseum with games that lasted 100 days, during which thousands died, men animals, slaves, even condemned criminals dressed in theatrical costumes and made to reenact myths before being executed. For the emperors, the arena was a theatre of legitimacy. It proved their wealth, their power, their pietas, their pious dedication to Rome's traditions. But it also showed their mercy. To spare a gladiator at the crowd's request was an act of benevolence. To intervene in a match, to grant a defeated man his life, these were the moments in which emperors shaped their public image. They became arbiters of fate, gods among men. And the gladiators, they became living avatars of this dynamic. Their survival, their deaths, their triumphs, all reflected the values Rome claimed to uphold: bravery, discipline, endurance, spectacle. They were instruments of moral storytelling. They reminded the people what it meant to be Roman. Yet for all their symbolism, gladiators remained paradoxes. They were simultaneously revered and reviled. They were not full citizens. They were property. They could not vote, could not own land, could not marry legally. And yet, they were household names. Their portraits were carved into rings. Women of high birth risked everything for a single night in their arms. Senators debated their role in public life. Poets wrote verses about their deaths. Children wore masks of their faces during festivals. Roman religion embraced them in strange, powerful ways. The games themselves were often framed as sacred rites. Before each combat, a ceremony was held. Priests blessed the arena. Animals were sacrificed. The pompa, the grand parade, featured not only musicians and fighters, but also representations of gods and mythical creatures. The games became a kind of living mythos, where men played the roles of heroes, monsters, and fated victims. In some matches, gladiators were dressed as Theseus, Hercules, or Perseus, reenacting legends through mortal combat. In death, the gladiator was mourned like a hero. His name was etched into stone, his likeness painted in tombs. Families of fallen fighters often formed collegia, funerary societies that ensured their brothers would be remembered, their graves maintained. In some regions, shrines were erected to particularly beloved champions, where people came to pray for courage, for strength, even for fertility. Some Romans believed that the blood of a slain gladiator held power. It was used in love potions, in spells, in secret rites that blurred the lines between faith and superstition. Their influence stretched even into fashion and slang. Young aristocrats aped their swagger. Artists mimicked their physique. Language absorbed their terms: rudis, lanista, missio. To be called a gladiator in the Senate was both an insult and a compliment. It meant you fought with passion, and perhaps with recklessness. The power of the gladiator lay in his duality. He was brutal, yet noble, low-born, yet luminous, enslaved, yet envied. He represented everything Rome wanted to be: disciplined, beautiful, victorious, and everything it feared becoming: wild, violent, consumed by blood. In many ways, the arena was Rome distilled, pure, raw, unmasked, and the gladiator, at its heart, was the embodiment of that ancient tension between glory and death, civilization and savagery, virtue and violence. The decline of the gladiatorial games was not sudden. It did not happen with a single law, nor did the sand grow quiet overnight. Instead, it was a slow unraveling, a fading of echoes in the great stone bowls of Rome's arenas. And as with all things ancient and mighty, their end came not from a single enemy, but from a chorus of forces: political weariness, shifting values, economic strain, and above all, the rise of a new faith that would reshape the very soul of the empire. In the twilight centuries of Roman rule, the empire was no longer expanding. The legions, once engines of conquest, now held the borders rather than pushed them. Gold flowed less freely. Rebellions flared more often. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. Amid this turbulence, the appetite for lavish games remained, but the cost grew harder to justify. The great spectacles of the past, with imported tigers from India, crocodiles from the Nile, elephants from Carthage, became extravagances even the wealthiest struggled to fund. The upkeep of amphitheaters, the feeding of beasts, the transport of slaves, and the training of fighters demanded sums better spent on military defense or grain subsidies. As Rome turned inward, the arena began to feel less like a heartbeat and more like a luxury. Philosophers had always harbored doubts about the games. Even in the Republic, Stoics like Seneca had written with unease about the spectacle. He described the crowd's thirst for cruelty with disgust and questioned the morality of enjoying a man's death for sport. Cicero, too, voiced discomfort, though he tempered it with political realism. But these voices were once drowned by the roar of the crowd. Now they began to be heard. A more decisive blow, however, came from a faith that had once been mocked in the catacombs, a faith born in distant Judea, carried on the backs of fishermen and martyrs, a faith that spoke not of Jupiter and Mars, but of a carpenter king who died upon a cross. Christianity. From its earliest days, Christianity opposed the games, not merely because of the bloodshed, but because of what the games represented: the glorification of death, the worship of the body, the dehumanization of the soul. Christians refused to attend. They refused to cheer. Some, when condemned, even entered the arena as victims, thrown to beasts, not as criminals, but as witnesses to their faith. And in those silent deaths, unresisting, eyes turned heavenward, they planted a seed that would grow in the hearts of many. By the 4th century, Christianity was no longer the faith of the fringe. It was the faith of emperors. Constantine the Great, after his conversion, began a slow process of turning the imperial eye away from bloodsport. Though he did not ban the games outright, wary perhaps of angering the old guard, he ceased funding them. His sons and successors, increasingly Christian in tone and policy, followed suit. The state, once the patron of carnage, now looked elsewhere for its legitimacy. The public, too, began to shift. The younger generation, raised with Christian teachings, no longer saw the arena as sacred. The munera, once rites of ancestral honor, now felt like pagan relics. Bishops preached against them from pulpits. Converts destroyed statues of Hercules and Mars. A new Rome was rising, one where salvation came not through strength and spectacle, but through humility and piety. Still, the games clung to life. Old habits die slowly. In some regions, especially in the West, arenas still filled on festival days. Gladiators still fought, though fewer in number, with less grandeur, but they were ghosts of their former selves. Where once their names rang through marble corridors, now they were barely announced. The crowds thinned. The cheers grew softer. The blood dried faster on the sand. Then came the edicts. In 325 CE, Constantine's Council of Nicaea condemned certain forms of violence, though the games remained officially untouched. In 354, the Roman calendar listed fewer and fewer public festivals involving combat. By 393, under Theodosius I, the same emperor who made Christianity the official religion of the empire, many pagan traditions were outlawed entirely. And in 404 CE, the final blow came. It was not a sword that ended it, nor a law alone, but a man, a Christian monk named Telemachus. The story, passed down through both legend and chronicle, tells of a lone monk who journeyed to Rome and entered the Colosseum during a gladiator match. As the crowd roared and blades clashed, Telemachus leapt into the arena and cried out against the violence. He pleaded with the fighters to stop, with the crowd to repent, with the city to see. Some jeered, some threw stones, and someone, whether a guard or a spectator, struck him down. He died on that very sand. But his death, quiet, principled, unarmed, struck a different kind of blow. The Emperor Honorius, horrified, issued a final edict. Gladiatorial combat was abolished in the Western Empire. The arenas fell silent. The Colosseum stood, but its games were over. Some regions, especially in the East, clung to ritual combats for a few decades more. But the age of the gladiator was finished. The sand was left to dust. The tunnels beneath the amphitheaters filled with earth and silence. The statues cracked. The cheers were gone. What remained were stories and memory. Rome would fall in time, not with a single collapse, but in slow erosion. But the image of the gladiator endured. Through medieval ballads, through Renaissance paintings, through cinema and song, he became a symbol again, not of empire, but of human struggle, of survival, of courage, of what it means to be seen and remembered. Beneath the silent stones of Rome, in the layers of dust that time forgets, the truth of the gladiator endures. Not in poems, not in the stories of emperors or the roar of lost crowds, but in bone, in rusted iron, shattered teeth, and scratched graffiti, preserved by ash and accident. For centuries, the myths of the arena soared above the ruins, cloaked in drama and legend. But it is the spade of the archaeologist, not the pen of the poet, that has begun to reveal who these men, and sometimes women, truly were. Perhaps no place has given us a clearer glimpse into the hidden world of the gladiator than the city of Pompeii. Buried under the volcanic ash of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, the city was frozen in a final breath. An entire society captured in death, untouched for nearly 2,000 years. In its arena, its training grounds, and its graffiti-covered walls, Pompeii preserves the heartbeat of the games. There, near the amphitheatre, excavators uncovered the Ludus Gladiatorius, the barracks where fighters lived, trained, and waited for fate to summon them to the sand. Inside the complex, archaeologists found weapons, armor, wooden practice swords, and iron shackles. They found skeletons, twisted in death, bearing wounds consistent with both training and battle. Some bore evidence of healed fractures, signs of lives lived in violence and repetition. Others showed brutal, fatal wounds, punctured skulls, shattered ribs, the unmistakable cleave of a sword across a femur. Yet even in death, the fighters were not nameless. On the walls of Pompeii's streets and inns, graffiti has survived, scratched by citizens into plaster, unfiltered, raw, alive with admiration and lust. Celadus the Thracian, 3 times victorious, the delight of all the girls, reads one. Another proclaims, Crescens the net fighter, the night is not long enough for him. These were not simple etchings, they were public shrines of fame, snapshots of a fighter's legacy, immortalized by the hands of those who adored them. Further discoveries came in places like Ephesus, in modern-day Turkey, where an entire gladiator cemetery was uncovered. There, dozens of skeletons were studied using modern forensic methods. Some bore the marks of surgical procedures, trepanned skulls, amputations, careful bone resets, revealing that medical care in the ludus was more advanced than once assumed. Others bore symmetrical scars, indicating repeated blows in specific combat styles, consistent with the structured roles of gladiator classes. One of the most revealing discoveries came not from wounds, but from the bones themselves. Analysis of gladiator skeletons from Ephesus and other sites showed high levels of calcium, far higher than typical for the time. This confirmed historical sources that described a special gladiator diet, rich in plant ash, brewed into a kind of mineral tonic, believed to strengthen the body and heal fractures. The so-called gladiator's drink, once dismissed as legend, was etched into their very bones. Artifacts, too, tell stories. In the ruins of Rome, archaeologists have recovered helmets bearing intricate designs, fish, snakes, griffins, symbols of strength, agility, and fate. Some bore notches from blades. Others had dents that told of close calls and lucky parries. Swords, greaves, and shields recovered from training yards showed wear in specific spots, the marks of repeated drills, of men learning to strike the same way, again and again, until instinct replaced thought. And then there are the gravestones. Across the empire, hundreds of gladiator tombs have been unearthed. Humble, yes, but rich with detail. These stones often depict the fighter in his battle pose, name carved proudly beneath. Some mention age and victories. Flamma Secuta, age 30, fought 34 times, won 21, drawn 9, lost 4. Others offer poetry or epitaphs from comrades and lovers. To the brave Hermes, fallen too soon, your brother in arms raises this stone, and with it, his sorrow. The gravestones reveal something the poets missed, the dignity claimed by the fighters themselves. They may have been slaves, but they refused to be forgotten. Their deaths were public, but they still sought identity. Even in a society that considered them property, they carved names into stone to say, I was here, I mattered. In recent years, digital reconstructions have brought even more insight. Using CT scans and facial reconstruction techniques, scientists have recreated the visages of some gladiators from their skulls. These faces, rough, scarred, weary, humanize what history once stylized. They are not heroes or monsters. They are men. Men who trained until their muscles tore, who fought while bleeding, who died for the sound of strangers clapping. The truth in the dirt, the scars on the bones, the ink of the graffiti, all of it shows us that the myth of the gladiator was never merely a fiction. It was rooted in blood and dust, in ritual and resilience. The arena, for all its cruelty, produced not only legend, but memory. And archaeology is the quiet whisper that restores voice to the voiceless. Even now, new discoveries are unearthed each year. A helmet in a riverbed, a graffito in a forgotten cellar, a fragment of a poem preserved in wax. Each one is a stitch in the tapestry of truth. Each one tells us not just how gladiators lived and died, but how they endured. She entered the arena not with the thunder of a legion, but with the gasp of surprise. Her presence alone was enough to unsettle the expectations of an audience raised to see men as the sole architects of bloodsport. Yet there she stood, helmeted, armored, armed, a gladiatrix, a female gladiator, an anomaly in the masculine world of Roman violence, and yet real, undeniable, and more than once victorious. The existence of female gladiators in ancient Rome was rare, but not unheard of. They were not part of the mainstream ludus system, nor were they mass-trained in the great schools like Capua or Pompeii. Instead, they were often hired for special games, curated spectacles meant to shock, amuse, or titillate. Their rarity made them valuable. Their gender made them controversial. And their courage, when they stepped onto the sand, was no less than that of their male counterparts. Roman writers mention them with a mixture of awe, scorn, and fascination. Suetonius, in his biography of Emperor Domitian, records that women fought in the Colosseum by torchlight during nighttime games, alongside dwarves and exotic animals, a theatrical display meant to amuse the elite. Juvenal, the satirical poet, writes with disdain of noble women abandoning the loom for the sword, mocking them for training in private like male fighters. Yet his very mockery confirms their existence. If they did not fight, there would be no need to shame them. These women, called gladiatrices, were sometimes slaves, sometimes volunteers, and occasionally free-born women of high status, drawn to the fame and danger of the games. For some, it was rebellion against the suffocating roles prescribed by Roman society. For others, it was spectacle, a way to command attention in a world where women were seldom seen and almost never heard. The Roman world was deeply patriarchal. Women were expected to be modest, obedient, cloistered within the domus, the home. To see a woman in a tunic of mail, carrying a gladius, her hair bound beneath a helmet, was not merely surprising. It was revolutionary. It upended the visual grammar of power, and for that reason, female gladiators were often treated not with respect, but with ridicule, or with erotic fascination. But in the arena, none of that mattered. Once the tuba sounded, and the crowd fell into breathless anticipation, the female fighter was no longer woman or wife or slave. She was a combatant. Her body moved with the same training. Her sword struck with the same purpose. Her blood spilled with the same finality. In the dust of the sand, gender blurred. Only performance remained. We know little of their training, whether they were taught by male doctors, or trained in private, or mentored by other women. No ludus specifically for women has yet been discovered, but inscriptions and frescoes suggest that at least some were trained to a high standard. One inscription from Halicarnassus in modern-day Turkey refers to a woman named Achillea, described as a worthy opponent of the Amazon. Another, in the form of a relief now in the British Museum, shows two women gladiators named Amazon and Achillea fighting in a match declared stantes missae, both released from the fight while still standing. A draw, a display of skill so even and admirable that neither was forced to die. Their armor was similar, though often adapted. Helmets were lighter, breastplates sometimes absent, perhaps due to theatrical considerations, perhaps due to necessity. Shields were scaled to their stature. The gladius remained standard, as did the rules of engagement. There was no special pity shown for them once the match began. They bled, they suffered, they killed, and sometimes they died. Their participation was always controversial. Some senators called for bans, others welcomed them as novelties. Emperor Septimius Severus eventually issued a decree banning female participation in the games in the early 3rd century CE, not necessarily out of moral horror, but perhaps due to the growing influence of Christian ideals and the erosion of old Roman spectacles. The edict marked the official end of women in the arena. But the legend lingered. Why did they fight? For some, it was coercion, a punishment, a forced display, the whim of a powerful master. For others, it was fame, to stand before a roaring crowd, to prove one's strength, to leave behind the needle and the spindle for the sword. This was freedom, even if it ended in death. For the noble women who fought in private, it may have been a perverse luxury, a thrill forbidden by custom, but enabled by wealth. For the enslaved, it may have been the only way to be seen, to have a name shouted, to be more than a shadow. In all cases, their choice, or lack thereof, reflected the contradictions of Rome itself, a society obsessed with control, yet addicted to spectacle, a culture that confined women, yet found pleasure in watching them defy those boundaries. The gladiatrix stood at the intersection of repression and rebellion, performance and power, body and identity. Today, little remains of their memory, a broken relief here, a scratched name there, whispers in the writings of men who never fought. But archaeology continues to search. Each fragment unearthed may someday give us her face, her age, the weight of her armor, the path of the blade that took her life. Until then, she remains a silhouette on the sand, a woman who stood where none were meant to stand, who fought where none were meant to fight. In the centuries since the last true gladiator fell silent on Roman sand, the image of the arena has never truly vanished. It has echoed through art, through opera, through literature, and most powerfully, through the glowing screens of cinema and television. The gladiator has become one of the most enduring archetypes in Western imagination. Not as he was, but as we wished him to be. A hero, a rebel, a lone figure standing tall against tyranny with sword in hand and vengeance in his heart. But in this myth, much has been lost, and something new, something shaped by the dreams, fears, and values of our own time, has taken its place. It began in the paintings of the Renaissance and Baroque periods, when Rome's ruins were rediscovered and romanticized. Artists painted idealized warriors, muscular, noble, tragic. The Colosseum became a symbol of fallen grandeur, and with it, the gladiator was recast not as a blood-soaked slave, but as a figure of pathos, a victim of a cruel world, a mirror held up to the decay of virtue. These early depictions laid the groundwork for the transformation to come. But it was the 20th century that truly gave the gladiator a new life. Hollywood found in the arena a perfect stage, epic, exotic, brutal, dramatic. In black and white classics like Demetrius and the Gladiators, or the grand spectacle of Ben-Hur, the fighter became part of a moral struggle. Often juxtaposed with Christianity, framed not as a willing participant in violence, but as a soul longing for salvation. In these early portrayals, the gladiator was rarely a Roman. He was an outsider, a prisoner, a convert, a martyr. Then came Spartacus, 1960, Stanley Kubrick's towering contribution to gladiatorial mythology. Here, the gladiator was no longer just a victim, he was a revolutionary. Kirk Douglas's portrayal of Spartacus, based on the historical Thracian rebel who led a slave uprising, became the definitive image of the noble gladiator. Strong, articulate, compassionate, and defiant, he fought not just for freedom, but for justice. The line, "I'm Spartacus," echoed by his comrades in defiance, became an anthem of solidarity across the ages. But this image, powerful as it was, bore only faint resemblance to reality. Spartacus was indeed real. He did lead a slave revolt, but whether he ever gave speeches about liberty or wept for fallen comrades remains unknown. He was a general, a killer, a symbol, but Hollywood remade him into a hero in our own image, one who fights for ideals, not merely survival. Decades later, Ridley Scott's Gladiator, 2000, would ignite a new wave of fascination. Russell Crowe's Maximus was a Roman general turned slave, a wronged man driven by loss and honor. His story, though fictional, combined many elements of the modern myth. The arena as a place of revenge, redemption, and personal triumph. "Are you not entertained?" he shouts, a line that has become iconic. But in truth, no gladiator would have dared insult the crowd. To do so was to invite death. Gladiator revived interest in the Roman world and inspired documentaries, books, and museum exhibitions. But it also cemented misconceptions. In modern media, the gladiator is usually depicted as a rugged individualist, a lone wolf, often fighting against corruption or empire. The reality was different. Gladiators were part of a machine. Most did not fight for freedom or honor. They fought because they were owned, because they had no choice. Their rebellions, when they came, were not always clean or noble. They were brutal, desperate, and often crushed without mercy. Even the fights themselves are misrepresented. Films often depict chaotic, frantic brawls with screaming, charging, blood flying in all directions. But the real combats were choreographed, practiced, and often more ritualistic than frenzied. The best gladiators were performers, skilled, strategic, and trained to pace their movements for maximum crowd engagement. A quick kill was sometimes a disappointment. A good match needed rhythm, tension. Armor in films is another point of distortion. Modern portrayals often favor leather straps, bare chests, and oversized weapons. Aesthetics borrowed more from fantasy than history. In truth, gladiators wore heavy bronze helmets, metal greaves, and shields appropriate to their class. They were not meant to be agile action heroes. They were meant to endure. The romantic subplots, the secret love affairs with noblewomen, the gladiator who wins freedom and rides off into the sunset. These, too, are inventions. Yes, some fighters earned fame. Yes, some had lovers. But the overwhelming truth is that most died young, anonymous, buried in shared graves outside city walls. Yet, for all its distortions, the myth of the gladiator persists and serves a purpose. It speaks to something eternal in us, the desire to rise against odds, the longing for recognition, the fantasy of power in a powerless world, the idea that courage can still shine, even when all is lost. Modern reinterpretations, from novels to video games to television series, reflect our current values projected onto an ancient stage. We cast the gladiator as the underdog, the liberator, the voice of resistance. And while this may not be historically accurate, it is emotionally truthful. We need our heroes, and the sand of the arena is fertile ground for myth. The real gladiators, nameless, broken, brutalized, might not recognize themselves in these stories, but perhaps they would understand why we tell them, because in the end, to remember is to honor. To mythologize is to grant immortality. And the gladiator, whose very name means swordsman, continues to fight, not with steel, but with story. Fear was the first thing they learned to swallow, not the fear of pain, that came later, dulled by repetition and scar tissue, but the fear of time, the endless hours between knowing you would be chosen and actually stepping into the sand. It was a silence that hollowed men out, a dread that nested in the gut, coiled like a serpent and waited to strike when all was quiet. For the gladiator, the greatest weapon wasn't the sword or shield, it was the mind. And mastering it was a daily war. From the moment a man entered the ludus, he began living under the shadow of death. Unlike a soldier who marched into battle occasionally, the gladiator lived in a state of constant psychological siege. Every day was a rehearsal for dying. The oath he swore, to be burned, bound, beaten, and killed by the sword, was not poetic exaggeration. It was a daily truth etched into the routines of his life. This constant presence of death changed a man. It reshaped his thoughts, his sleep, his perception of time and self. Some responded with stoicism. They closed off their emotions, laughed rarely, spoke only when necessary. They moved through the world with the heavy silence of men already half gone. Others clung to rituals, tying a piece of cloth a certain way, stepping with the left foot first when entering the training yard, whispering the same words before sleep. These were not just quirks. They were talismans, protective charms carved from repetition. The mind sought order where the world offered chaos. Sleep was often restless. Many gladiators developed what modern psychology might call hypervigilance, a state of constant alertness where the body never truly relaxes. Nightmares were common. Dreams of falling swords, of faceless opponents, of screams from a crowd that never ends. Some awoke in the middle of the night with their fists clenched, gasping as though they had drowned. And when sleep finally came deeply, it was usually from exhaustion, not peace. The ludus itself became both sanctuary and prison. Within its walls, the gladiator was known, understood, protected in a strange way by the structure of training and hierarchy. But beyond those walls, in the arena, all of that fell away. The sand did not remember loyalty. The crowd did not cheer for fear. A man had to learn to control his terror or become its victim. Fear, if unmastered, became poison. It made the hand tremble, the breath short, the eyes twitch. Instructors watched carefully for these signs. The doctors were not merely physical trainers, they were mental engineers. They taught men not to flinch at the sound of a blade, not to blink when blood splattered, not to falter when the crowd screamed for death. They did not use kindness, they used pressure, exposure, brutality. A man who panicked in training was ridiculed, isolated, sometimes beaten, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. The arena had no room for doubt. Some men adapted by detaching from reality. They created personas, masks. They became their gladiator names: Lupus, Crixus, Thrax. The name became armor. The person inside, the man who once had a mother, a favorite food, a lover, was buried beneath it. To become the mask was to survive. In this, the gladiator resembled the actor, the ritual priest, the performer. He stepped onto the sand, not as a man, but as a role. Roles do not bleed. Roles do not fear. Others embraced fatalism. They believed deeply in fatum, destiny, that each man's death was already written, and thus there was no point in resisting it. These men were often the most fearless. They fought with a kind of serenity that unnerved their opponents. To them, the blade was simply the tool fate would use to end their chapter. But until then, until that exact appointed moment, they were untouchable. Religion offered solace too. Many gladiators prayed daily, not just to Mars, but to Fortuna, Nemesis, Mithras, Isis, even to foreign gods carried with them from conquered lands. Small shrines were built in corners of the ludus. Offerings were left, a sliver of meat, a coin, a carved bone. These acts weren't just devotion, they were psychological anchors. A man with a god could feel less alone in the arena. A man with a god could believe his suffering had meaning. Comrades became therapists of a kind. No one understood the fear of the arena like another gladiator. They talked in hushed tones after training, shared old stories, gave advice on how to breathe, how to slow your heart, how to stay alive long enough to react. They taught each other tricks for staying sane, how to picture the crowd naked, how to count to 3 before moving, how to spit before the first blow to show you weren't afraid, even if you were. And still, some broke. There were those who, one morning, simply stopped speaking. Others refused to fight, knowing the punishment that would follow. A few took their own lives, using belt, bone, or bloodied rock. The records do not say their names. The stones do not remember. But the sand does. Somewhere beneath the Colosseum, beneath centuries of dust, the echoes of their silence remain. Modern psychologists might see in these men symptoms of PTSD, dissociation, trauma bonding, and learned helplessness. But in their time, there were no words for such things, only survival, and the knowledge that tomorrow you might be called again. Yet despite the fear, the trauma, the unrelenting pressure of death, some men found clarity in it, purpose, a strange freedom that came from having nothing left to lose. In the arena, time stood still. The rules of the world faded. There was only the opponent, the sand, the breath, the blade. It was brutal, but it was honest. And for the gladiator, that fleeting moment of total presence, of being seen, known, cheered, or condemned, was the only truth that mattered. Behind every drop of blood spilled in the arena was a coin. Every roar of the crowd, every clash of sword and shield, every death knell, all were carefully measured parts of a vast, complex, and deeply profitable economy. The gladiatorial system was not simply a brutal form of entertainment. It was a business, a finely tuned engine of commerce that fed thousands, enriched hundreds, and reached into nearly every level of Roman life, from the streets of the capital to the farthest reaches of the provinces. At its heart stood the lanista, the manager, owner, and merchant of gladiators. He was not merely a trainer, he was a businessman, often wealthy, usually ruthless, always calculating. The lanista invested heavily in his stock, purchasing slaves from markets, scouting talent among prisoners of war, and negotiating contracts with free men who volunteered for the arena in exchange for signing away their lives. Each man had a price. A skilled Mamillo might fetch more than a horse. A young, healthy retiarius with a flair for drama could be more valuable than a villa's worth of household slaves. These men were not paid wages, not in the traditional sense, but they did represent capital. The lanista housed them, trained them, fed them, and expected a return on that investment. The return came in two forms: performance fees and prize money. When a gladiator fought in a match, the editor, the public official or sponsor organizing the games, paid the lanista a fee. The more experienced and famous the fighter, the higher the fee. A single star combatant could command several times the usual rate, especially if advertised ahead of time. Posters and painted notices, libelli, were plastered across the city, listing the names, past victories, and fighting styles of the participants. These were not simple match notices. They were marketing. Training a gladiator was expensive, and schools required constant upkeep. The ludus needed guards, trainers, doctors, blacksmiths, cooks, and scribes. Armor had to be crafted and maintained, weapons replaced, medical supplies restocked. Injured gladiators required rest and treatment, which meant downtime and no revenue. The lanista had to balance risk with potential reward. Some fighters were pushed too soon and died in their first match, a total loss. Others trained for months, building value with every session. And when one became a star, the lanista protected him fiercely, like a prized racehorse. But the lanista did not operate in isolation. He was deeply entwined with Rome's political and social networks. Senators and aediles, especially those seeking public office, often negotiated directly with schools to book talent for their games. These games were expensive, and the men who funded them expected returns, not in coin, but in popularity, prestige, and public favor. A successful spectacle could boost a political career. A dull one could end it. It was here that Rome's economy and its appetite for blood converged. The state did not always fund the games. Instead, it relied on private sponsors, editores, to pay for everything, from the beasts to the sand to the fighters themselves. These men, often from the senatorial or equestrian class, viewed games as a kind of civic performance. To give the people bread and circuses was to earn their loyalty, and loyalty could be turned into votes, into business deals, into imperial favor. The games were also deeply connected to the economy of spectacle. Vendors flooded the amphitheaters on game days, selling wine, olives, fried chickpeas, sweet cakes, and cheap memorabilia, small clay figurines of famous fighters, amulets bearing the symbols of popular gladiator schools. Money changed hands constantly. Betting, though technically discouraged by the law, flourished in the shadows. Odds were whispered through crowds. Coins passed between sleeves. The success or failure of a single match could make or ruin fortunes overnight. And behind it all loomed the empire itself. Gladiators were tools of imperial ideology. They demonstrated Rome's power, its control over life and death. Many were foreigners, their defeat in the arena a symbolic reenactment of Roman conquest. When a Dacian or a Briton or a Nubian fell in the sand, it reinforced the message: Rome rules, Rome decides, Rome is eternal. Even the logistics of the games revealed the scale of the system. Slaves and beasts were imported by the thousands. Contracts were signed across borders. Special ships carried lions from North Africa, bears from Gaul, elephants from India. Each transport required handlers, bribes to port officials, fees to local governors. The trade in blood was international, and the empire's veins pulsed with it. At the peak of the system, entire towns thrived around amphitheaters. Armorers built custom gear. Tailors designed flashy tunics and cloaks for victorious fighters. Doctors specialized in treating sword wounds and crushed bones. Artists painted victory murals and prepared tombstones for those who didn't return. The death of a single man could feed dozens. And yet, the fighters themselves saw only a fraction of this wealth. A successful gladiator could win prizes, coins, jewelry, even property. He might earn enough to buy better food, better lodging, a woman's favor. A few, the truly elite, accumulated enough to buy their freedom, but most earned only the right to live another day, and even that, only if the crowd willed it. The economic machine that sustained the games was enormous, but cold. It did not mourn its losses. A dead fighter was written off, his armor stripped and reused, his body dragged away. Another would take his place. The sand always thirsted, and there was always another boy in chains, another man with debts, another prisoner of war. Rome's economy was not just fueled by conquest and trade. It was also fed by the spectacle of control, by proving again and again that it could purchase anything, even death, especially death. And so, behind every cheer was a coin, behind every funeral, an invoice, behind every legendary name, a ledger line. When a gladiator died, the arena did not pause. The crowd may have cheered, groaned, or briefly hushed, but the games continued. Death was expected. It was part of the show. Yet for the men who lived and died on the sand, death was not a curtain fall. It was a passage, and for some, a legacy. Rome, a society steeped in ritual and symbolism, gave even its most brutal institutions structure in death. And in the case of the gladiator, those rituals were complex, contradictory, and often as theatrical as the life he had just lost. The moment a gladiator fell in the arena, the spectacle shifted. If the crowd had granted him mercy and the editor denied it, or if he had fought sine missione, with no chance of reprieve, then the victor delivered the final blow. Death was expected to be swift, clean, theatrical. A precise stab beneath the ribcage, through the heart, a slash across the neck. The more composed the kill, the more dignified the ending in the eyes of the crowd. Once the man lay still, the Charon, a masked official, often dressed in black or bearing a hammer, stepped forward. His task was not to guide souls, as the name might suggest, but to confirm death. He touched the body with a heated iron, or struck it with a mallet. There could be no mistake. The dead had to be dead. The games would not be stained with survival, masquerading as sacrifice. The body was then dragged from the arena, with hooks or on carts, often by slaves wearing masks, resembling gods of the underworld. It was a deliberate act of depersonalization, to remind the crowd that death had claimed its due, that the sands had been fed, and that the next performance could now begin. But outside the Colosseum, beyond the din of the arena, another world waited, one where the dead were remembered, and in some cases, revered. If the gladiator had earned renown, if his name had been cheered, his image painted on walls, his victories counted. Then his death sparked ritual. His comrades at the ludus might hold a vigil. They gathered at dusk, offering wine, bread, and sometimes coins placed beside the body to pay the ferryman of the underworld. If the fighter belonged to a collegium, a funeral guild, often formed within gladiator schools, then the group ensured he was buried properly. This was not charity, it was brotherhood, insurance against being forgotten. Burials varied. Some were modest, a grave outside the city walls, a wooden marker, a name carved into stone. Others were elaborate, wealthy patrons, impressed by the gladiator's valor, sometimes paid for elaborate tombs. These often included carvings of the fighter in his gear, inscriptions listing his victories, his age, and sometimes his last words. A well-known fighter could be buried with honors few slaves ever knew. In Rome, the treatment of the dead was not merely practical, it was spiritual. To die without burial was to wander the afterlife in torment. A gladiator's funeral, then, was not just a goodbye. It was a plea to the gods for peace, for memory, for honor. Families, if they existed or were permitted, might attend. Fellow fighters stood in silence, hands bound with cords in mourning. Small offerings were placed in the grave, pieces of armor, a coin with the emperor's face, a scrap of cloth from his tunic. Graffiti played a role in remembrance too. Walls of taverns, bathhouses, and even villas sometimes bore scrawled tributes. Valerius, killer of 9, friend to none, brave to the end. Rest well, Decimus the netman, who danced like wind and died like a lion. These were not official histories. They were voices of the people, fleeting, informal, yet human. But not all gladiators were honored. Some died in obscurity, broken and unnamed. Their bodies were discarded in mass graves, burned or fed to beasts. No stone bore their name, no coin marked their passing. Their bones lay mingled with others, forgotten by the city that once cheered their suffering. In these unmarked pits, archaeologists have found broken skulls, blade-split ribs, and scorched armor pieces, silent evidence of men who lived and died invisible. Yet even in death, some gladiators transcended their fate. A few became martyrs in their own right, not in the Christian sense, but as figures of local cults or folk legends. Children whispered stories about their courage. Poor Romans lit candles near their tombs, asking for protection, bravery, or even fertility. The blood of the fallen was believed by some to carry power, a holdover from older pagan rites, where blood sacrifice brought favor from the gods. Over time, as Christianity took root, the treatment of gladiator graves changed. Their memory became less public, less celebrated. The church viewed the arena as a place of cruelty and sin, and the men who fought in it as victims of a godless age. Tombs were defaced, shrines dismantled, but the stories survived, hidden in the bricks, in the pages of poets and satirists, in the whisper of stones buried beneath centuries of soil. To modern archaeologists and historians, these graves are more than relics. They are testimony. Each tombstone is a voice, each skeleton a chapter. Through carbon testing, isotopic analysis, and forensic reconstruction, we now know how they lived, how they suffered, how they died, and most importantly, that they existed not as myths, but as men. Men who knew that death could come any day. Men who prepared for it, not with tears, but with grit and silence. Men who, despite being owned, beaten, commodified, chose to die standing. They were more than spectators. They were judges, juries, and at times executioners. Tens of thousands of voices rising and falling in unison, a sea of power that ebbed and surged with every swing of the sword. The Roman crowd was not passive. It did not simply watch the games. It created them. For the gladiator, the crowd was everything. It was the wind at his back or the weight around his neck. The audience could raise a man to fame or bury him in silence. Its roar could grant mercy. Its silence could condemn. In a city obsessed with spectacle, the crowd held the authority of kings, not by blood, but by sheer volume. The relationship between the gladiator and the Roman crowd was not built on admiration alone. It was an intense, performative dialogue, one of anticipation, expectation, and emotion. From the moment a gladiator stepped into the arena, he was not just a warrior. He was an actor, a showman, a vessel for the people's hunger, joy, frustration, and fury. Rome's amphitheaters, especially the Colosseum, were marvels of design, built not just for viewing, but for emotional immersion. The seats were tiered by class, senators in the front rows, equestrians behind them, then the commoners, and finally the slaves and foreigners at the top. But when the games began, all became equal in one regard. They could all cheer, they could all shout, and they all could decide a man's fate. When two gladiators fought well, with skill, honor, and drama, the crowd responded with thunderous approval. But if one turned coward, fled, or begged too soon, they hissed, shouted, and threw debris. Roman crowds had little patience for shame. A gladiator who died well, even in defeat, earned respect. A fighter who disappointed could be laughed off the sand, humiliated in death. And then there was the moment of decision. When a man fell and raised his finger to beg for mercy, the missio, the crowd erupted. Some shouted for clemency, "Mitte, release him." Others screamed for death, "Jugula, cut his throat." The editor of the games, seated in his regal box, listened carefully. He raised his hand, sometimes with thumb up, sometimes down, sometimes sideways, to indicate his ruling. Contrary to modern myth, the gestures varied. What mattered was the will of the people, and how the editor chose to answer it. This moment was theatre of the highest order. The defeated man knelt, breathless, bleeding. The victor stood above him, sword poised, and in that electric pause, before life or death was declared, the arena held its breath. It was not just about justice. It was about satisfaction. Had the crowd been entertained? Had the gladiators done their part? A victorious fighter who gave the crowd what it wanted was showered with gifts. Coins were tossed onto the sand, sometimes flowers, sometimes ribbons. His name would be whispered in taverns that night, painted on walls the next day. Children would reenact his match with sticks and shields of wicker. For those few who could stir the audience to wild applause, who could combine athleticism with showmanship, brutality with grace, fame came like a tidal wave. The crowd adored certain personalities. They cheered the daring, the defiant, the beautiful. They loved rivalry. If two fighters had faced each other before, or had a rumored grudge, the amphitheater pulsed with anticipation. Cheers became chants. Names rang out from tier to tier. Sometimes whole districts of the city would adopt a favorite, a Mamiglio from Trastevere, a retiarius from the Subura, turning the games into a kind of civic sport. But the crowd could be fickle. Glory faded fast. A poor match, a limp performance, a cowardly retreat. Any could turn love into contempt. Booing was as public as applause. There are stories of gladiators who, once stars of the sand, were later mocked, beaten, or even stoned by disappointed mobs. Fame was a fragile shield. Still, for many gladiators, the crowd was all they had. Their families were gone. Their freedom was gone. But the people, they could offer something the lanista never would. Immortality, to be known, to be remembered, to have one's name written not on a slave's collar, but on a wall, in red pigment, beside a palm frond, and the words, Victor in 7. And so, gladiators played to them. They lifted their weapons in salute. They delayed the final blow for suspense. They taunted their foes for laughter. They died with arms outstretched, eyes open, to remind the crowd, I was not afraid. That final performance mattered most. A well-dyed man was not just pitied, he was admired. In truth, the relationship between gladiator and crowd was a kind of brutal intimacy. Both needed each other. The crowd needed blood, catharsis, release. The gladiator needed recognition. In a society that reduced him to flesh and coin, the crowd could still grant him a name, a legacy, a moment of power. In the roar of 50,000 voices, he was no longer a slave. He was someone. And in Rome, sometimes, that was all that mattered. The gladiator's body was not his own. From the moment he took the oath to endure burning, binding, beating, and death by the sword, his flesh became a tool, a weapon, a performance. It was property, sculpted by others, for the pleasure of the crowd and the profit of the lanista. And in this transformation, the body ceased to be a vessel of the self and became something else entirely, an offering. Forged in sweat, bruises, and broken bone, the gladiator's physique was molded through endless drills, weighted routines, sparring with wooden swords heavier than steel, and footwork patterns carved into the dirt like sacred dance. He trained under sun and rain, barefoot or sandal-shod, without reprieve. The goal was not speed alone. It was endurance, precision, brutality balanced with control. Their training made them strong, but not bulky in the way modern athletes might imagine. Gladiators needed stamina more than sprinting ability, strength without the loss of breath. Their diets, rich in barley and legumes, gave them weight. Sometimes even a slight layer of fat, which paradoxically served a purpose. That layer could help protect vital organs from shallow cuts. A lean body might look fast, but a slightly padded one survived longer. And survival was everything. Yet no matter how prepared, no body escaped unscathed. Injuries were constant companions: cracked ribs, dislocated shoulders, torn ligaments. Scars mapped a gladiator's history. A long line across the bicep from a careless block, a jagged gash at the collarbone from a downward strike, a depression at the temple where a blunt pommel once landed. These wounds were not merely reminders, they were badges. Each one told a story. Each one said, I lived. Archaeological studies of gladiator remains, from Ephesus to Pompeii, show bones riddled with trauma. Healed fractures were common, suggesting repeated injury and recovery. Arm bones were often thickened from repetitive strain. Shoulders showed signs of asymmetrical development. especially in fighters who specialized in single-handed weapons. Vertebrae were compressed from endless impact. Knees were worn down by years of kneeling and sudden turns. The hands, perhaps the most telling of all, bore knotted fingers, fractured knuckles, and calluses hard as leather. Some were missing fingers entirely. Others showed fused joints where wounds had not healed properly. These were not hands of artisans or scribes. They were tools made to grip, to crush, to kill. Even teeth tell the story. Many skulls show worn molars, possibly from gritting during combat, or from biting on cloth during crude surgeries. Some show signs of stress lines, tiny fractures caused by repeated trauma, or bruxism, the grinding of teeth under pressure. Others had broken teeth entirely, likely shattered by fists, falls, or the edge of a shield. Injuries during combat were expected, but recovery was not a luxury, it was a requirement. Schools had medici, doctors trained in battlefield medicine, whose job was not to heal perfectly, but to patch, to make the fighter functional again. Bones were set with splints of wood and linen. Wounds were cauterized with hot iron. Herbal poultices of myrrh, vinegar, and honey were applied. Painkillers included opium, wine, and at times sedation by pressure to the head or compression of the limbs. Infection was common, amputation rare but known. But the most grueling damage was internal. The gladiator learned to compartmentalize pain. He learned to move despite it, to breathe through cracked ribs, to kneel with torn ligaments. There was no reward for visible weakness. Blood was expected. Limping was overlooked. Screams were discouraged. Even in agony, the crowd demanded composure, dignity in suffering. The only thing worse than dying in the arena was dying badly. And then there were the brands. Most gladiators were slaves, and slaves were marked, a symbol on the arm, a letter on the thigh, sometimes on the face, FUG for fugitivus, a runaway, PM for punitus malus, badly punished. These brands were burned into the skin with iron, a permanent reminder of status, of crime, of ownership. They could not be washed off, only covered, and in the arena, often displayed. Tattoos were worn too, some voluntary, some not. Magical symbols, names of loved ones, phrases invoking protection. These marks turned the body into a canvas of devotion and defiance. The flesh was not just scarred, it was inscribed with identity. And the gladiator himself came to understand his body as a weapon. He learned the weight of his arm, the range of his swing, the angle of his lunge. He knew how to fall without breaking bone, how to roll beneath a strike, how to strike where armor parted. He honed his body as a blacksmith hones steel, through fire, through repetition, through will. But the cost was immense. Few survived into old age. The body wore down. Arthritis set in early. Vision blurred. Breathing grew shallow from cracked ribs, never healed right. Some retired fighters limped for life. Others died in their cells, not from combat, but from exhaustion. A handful lived long enough to teach. Doctors, their backs crooked, their hands twisted, but their minds sharp, their voices still commanding. And yet, despite the pain, many gladiators were proud of their bodies. They oiled their muscles before a match. They trained obsessively. They posed in frescoes. Their physiques were admired, sketched, carved into lamps, painted in homes. For a man with nothing else, No name, no freedom, no property. The body was all he had. It was his resume, his currency, his mirror. In a world where survival was uncertain and legacy was fleeting, the gladiator's body was his rebellion, his truth, his art. They had no names the world would remember. No walls bore their likeness. No poets sang of their courage. They were the unknown, the forgotten, the countless men, and sometimes women, who lived, fought, and died in the arena, leaving behind only silence and sand. For every famed gladiator etched into stone, there were hundreds more whose lives flickered like oil lamps, brief, bright, then gone. They came from distant provinces, nameless among the crowds, captured in wars no Roman cared to document, condemned for crimes whose records did not survive, sold into schools with no hope of release. They died not in dramatic duels before emperors, but in early morning matches, in provincial arenas, before half-full seats and uninterested magistrates. And yet they fought just the same. They woke at dawn, stretched sore limbs, and ate the same barley porridge. They trained, bled, bruised. They learned the drills, endured the scorn, survived the sparring. They had brothers in arms. They had rivalries. They had hopes, maybe not for glory, but for another day alive. The records do not list their victories, because the scribes only recorded the best. The public remembered champions, not contenders. Yet the forgotten were the foundation of the games. It was they who filled the lesser matches, warmed up the crowd, tested new tactics, new weapons, new formats. Their deaths were routine. They were practicing. They were filler. Their funerals, if given, were humble. A shallow grave, a marker made of wood, quickly rotted. If their comrades were kind, they pooled coins for a stone, but most vanished without record, known only to the men who trained beside them, who saw them fall, and then marched back to their cells in silence. They were the ones who died before earning a name, before they had the chance to become feared or beloved, before they could carve notches into their shield rim or count their victories aloud. Yet their presence was not meaningless. They were the lifeblood of the machine. They were the bodies needed to sustain the appetite of Rome's public, to feed the spectacle, to give the illusion of endless warriors. They were like bricks in the Colosseum, not celebrated, but necessary. Without them, the edifice collapsed. Some were merely boys, captured in raids, sold by desperate families, or punished for theft, barely old enough to shave. Their first match was often their last. Some were old men, deemed useless elsewhere, but still strong enough to hold a sword, sent into the arena to die as an example. Others were sick, wounded, or unstable, condemned criminals, political enemies, scapegoats. The crowd did not care. They wanted drama. They wanted death. And these forgotten fighters were given to them. In the shadow of fame, these men endured. They learned to swing, to block, to fall. Their lives were as real as those of the champions, perhaps more so because they carried no armor of fame, no protection of reputation. They were vulnerable in every sense. They bled just as red. Their fear was just as sharp. Yet occasionally, one of them rose, a nameless fighter, underestimated, who survived a match. Then another. Perhaps he killed a favored opponent, surprising the crowd. Perhaps he showed skill, poise, restraint. And suddenly, the crowd knew his face. The scribes asked for his name. The lanista raised his price. From nothing, a legacy began, but most did not. They vanished into the earth, their bones unearthed centuries later by archaeologists, catalogued as male, aged 20 to 25, cause of death, blade wound. Their skulls bear cracks, their ribs clean breaks, their teeth worn down by grit and grain. No name, no history, just facts, remains, echoes, and yet their silence speaks. It reminds us that the arena was not only for the few who rose, but for the many who fell, that the cost of the spectacle was not paid by legends alone, but by an army of the unseen, that every great champion once stood beside the forgotten, trained with them, sparred with them, and saw them fall. Their stories, though unwritten, matter, because in honoring the nameless, we complete the truth of the games, not a parade of heroes, but a river of humanity, terrified, desperate, courageous, each man stepping onto the sand, heart pounding, knowing that his next breath might be his last. And even if no one called his name, he fought, and that, in Rome, was its own kind of immortality. Across the empire, in the shadow of temples and forums, rose the walls of the Ludi, the gladiator schools. They were not temples of knowledge, but of survival, not sanctuaries of learning, but factories of flesh. Each ludus bore its own identity, its own history, its own scars. And within those walls, generations of fighters lived, trained, and died, their stories woven into the stones, their rivalries bleeding into the sand. The most famous of all was the Ludus Magnus, situated in the heart of Rome, just steps from the Colosseum. It was the empire's elite school, directly connected to the great amphitheatre by an underground passage. To train at the Magnus was both privilege and pressure. The fighters who emerged from its cells were expected to entertain emperors, diplomats, and roaring multitudes. Its yard was vast, its instructors severe. It attracted the best trainers, the most hardened veterans, and the fiercest competitors. Fame in Rome began here, but so did despair. The expectations were immense. To stumble in the Colosseum was to fall before the world's eyes. Beyond Rome, other schools flourished. In Capua, the ludus there gained fame for its brutal discipline, and for being the birthplace of the Spartacus revolt. This school was a crucible of rebellion, forged in the harshness of its lanista, Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Batiatus. Here, dozens of enslaved fighters plotted in whispers and exchanged glances heavy with silent vows. One night, armed with kitchen knives and stolen iron tools, they broke free. They fled into the countryside and ignited the greatest slave uprising in Roman history. The school's name became both curse and legend. Rome never forgot. Pompey's ludus was smaller, but no less intense. Preserved in ash and memory, it has given modern scholars extraordinary insight into the daily routines of the fighters. There, bones still lie where they fell. Armor rests rusted on racks, and walls bear graffiti scribbled by trembling hands. Wagers on fights, insults traded between classes, and prayers scratched into plaster with broken fingernails. The Pompeian school was known for producing agile fighters, light-footed Thraces and nimble Retiari, men who relied on speed rather than brute strength. They died quickly or lived long, nothing in between. Each school had its own hierarchy. At the top stood the lanista, owner, master, and merchant. Some were former fighters themselves, broken but respected. Others were businessmen with no fighting past, known more for their cruelty than their courage. Beneath them were the doctors, trainers responsible for moulding the new recruits. Some specialized by weapon type. A doctor secutorum might train only heavy-class fighters, while another taught the techniques of net and trident. These instructors were revered and feared. Their word was law. Below them were the fighters, divided by experience. The veterani were battle-tested survivors, often scarred, often cold. They received better food, better beds, more lenient punishments. The novici, newcomers, were at the bottom. They fetched water, cleaned wounds, scrubbed floors. They trained until their hands bled, and still trained more. Their days were long, their nights short. Few lasted a year. But among the fighters, alliances and rivalries brewed like storm clouds. Some men formed tight bonds, brothers in arms, unspoken pacts of mutual protection. They trained together, ate together, prayed together. These groups moved like units, watching one another's backs in drills and helping hide bruises from the medicus to avoid being pulled from upcoming matches. Others became bitter rivals. A nod ignored, a stolen ration, an insult, a sparring match that ended with broken teeth. Tensions escalated quickly, especially as men vied for the same match slots, the same eyes in the crowd. Fighters were often ranked by a system of informal status, victories, crowd approval, and the favor of the lanista. Those favored received better armor, better opponents, better odds of survival. A man who could draw cheers became valuable, and therefore more protected. Those who failed to excite the crowd were given harsher matches, bloodier duels, crueler foes. It was a world of merit, but also of politics. Even within the walls, betrayal could bloom. There are stories, rarely written down, whispered between scholars, of fighters who sabotaged one another's armor, who bribed guards to pass on illnesses, who reported each other's misdeeds to the doctors. Desperation bred treachery. For many, one more win meant one more day alive. And in that brutal arithmetic, friendship was a luxury few could afford. Some schools formed dynasties of reputation. A famous ludus might train generations of fighters under the same methods, the same instructors, the same guiding principles. A school known for ruthless secutores or cleveretiarii could market itself across the empire. Games held in distant provinces requested fighters from Capua, from Magnus, from Batiatus's line. Schools sent fighters on circuit tours, allowing rising stars to gain recognition outside Rome. These tours were dangerous, but offered exposure and coin. A successful tour could elevate a fighter's status, pushing him closer to the prized rudies. But with fame came risk. When a fighter became a known name, painted on walls, chanted by crowds, the school had to protect him, or in some cases, profit from his downfall. A famous fighter's death in the right match could bring prestige, or even reward, to a cunning lanista. Not all died by chance. Some were pushed toward impossible odds, paired against three, given dulled weapons, poisoned with tainted wine the night before. Schools rose and fell with Rome itself. As the empire began to wane, the great ludi faced financial strain. Beasts were harder to acquire. Public enthusiasm dimmed. Emperors changed policies, and slowly the schools emptied. Some collapsed in debt. Others were converted into barracks, storehouses, or forgotten ruins. The graffiti faded. The cells were repurposed. And the last doctors, old men with twisted limbs and empty halls, died quietly in rooms that once echoed with battle cries. But beneath the earth, in buried corridors and sunken courtyards, the bones remain, and with them the stories of the schools, the gladiator factories, where boys became beasts and men became myth. Even as the clang of swords faded and the Colosseum's gates rusted shut, the image of the gladiator endured, not only in stone, not only in story, but in the living habits of Rome itself. For centuries after the last true match, the cultural aftershocks of gladiatorial life rippled through fashion, language, art, and even the way Romans defined courage, masculinity, and power. The arena had ended, but the gladiator had not. Long before the games were outlawed, Roman society had already begun absorbing elements of gladiatorial iconography into its bloodstream. Gladiators were the ultimate paradox: enslaved yet powerful, scorned yet worshipped, feared yet adored. Their bodies, their names, their mannerisms, all became cultural currency. Fashion was the first realm to bend. Young Roman men, especially those of the equestrian and senatorial classes, often emulated the fighters they had cheered. They copied the cropped hair and muscular builds. Tunics were tailored shorter to reveal more of the arms and thighs, a nod to the battle-ready appearance of the lightly armored classes. Some adopted belts and leather straps as decorative accessories, modeled after the baltus, the sword belt worn by gladiators. Even cosmetics and grooming came under the gladiator's spell. Oils used to gloss the bodies of fighters before combat became popular in Roman bathhouses. Men of means sought the same lustrous sheen, not from the labor of combat, but from carefully applied unguents mixed with herbs and resins. To shine like a champion was to borrow a bit of his glow. Women, too, were captivated and influenced by the presence of gladiators. Their portraits, etched in cameo or fresco, sometimes depicted them with gladiator paraphernalia: a miniature dagger tucked into the hair, an armband shaped like a laurel wreath, a necklace bearing the profile of a famed fighter. These were not merely flirtations with style. They were declarations of taste, desire, and even defiance. To be associated with the glamour of the arena was to be modern, daring, and unapologetically Roman. Language absorbed them next. Phrases born in the sand entered the Roman lexicon. Ad gladium ire, to go to the sword, came to mean facing danger with honor. Palma habet, he has the palm, indicated someone had won, not just in the arena, but in love, in business, or in politics. Terms like missio, rudis, and editor left the amphitheater and entered everyday speech, shorthand for mercy, reward, and control. Insults, too, bore the mark of the games. A coward might be called a retiarius, without a net, a man unequipped, exposed, ridiculous. A man who boasted too much might be mocked as a provocator, one who talks more than he fights. Children, playing in courtyards, shouted challenges in the stylized bravado of the arena. Even funeral speeches occasionally invoked gladiators to emphasize the deceased's bravery or sacrifice. In literature and art, the gladiator became muse. Poets compared lovers to Thraces and Mamios. Lovers duelled with words as if in the Colosseum. Epic novels set their heroes in fictional games, their battles more metaphor than memory. Mosaics adorned wealthy homes with scenes of famous duels. Even in homes where the owners had never seen a real match, the illusion of the arena offered status, virility, and spectacle. Public statues of gladiators, rare in life, became more common in death. Sculptors carved marble figures based on descriptions from the past. Bulging arms, noble profiles, weapons gleaming. These weren't merely decorative. They were aspirational. The gladiator had become an ideal of Roman identity, the model of physical perfection, stoic resolve, and willing sacrifice. His story, though born in pain, was retold as inspiration. In elite Roman culture, the gladiator became a philosophical touchstone. Stoic thinkers like Seneca and Epictetus, though often critical of the games themselves, still admired the virtues gladiators embodied. Endurance, acceptance of fate, dignity in suffering. To die with grace, as many gladiators did, became the ultimate test of character. Even funerary epitaphs of non-gladiators began borrowing the language of the arena. "He died as a gladiator would," they wrote, or "He did not seek missio, but stood until the end." In this way, the gladiator's death became a symbol of how to face life itself, not with fear, but with strength. In education, boys were taught about famous fights. In rhetoric schools, mock debates were held on whether a defeated gladiator deserved mercy. These weren't just exercises in logic. They were moral laboratories, using the arena as a metaphor for power, justice, and human nature. And perhaps most powerfully, the gladiator infiltrated memory. Long after the sand cooled, families claimed descent from famous fighters, whether true or not. Children were named after champions. Household gods were carved to resemble favored styles. In rural towns far from Rome, old men told tales of matches they'd once seen. Mothers used gladiator legends to scare unruly sons or inspire shy ones. The games had stopped, but the storytelling had only begun. Eventually, the gladiator crossed into religion, first as villain, then as martyr, then as symbol of Rome's moral decline. Christian writers saw in the arena a world of sin and cruelty, but also a stage upon which some of their own had perished, thrown to beasts, refusing to fight, dying in imitation of Christ. And so, paradoxically, the gladiator became entwined with sainthood, not as a killer, but as one who refused to kill. Today, the echo still lingers in our languages, in our films, in our sports, in our concept of honor. The word gladiator still conjures strength, spectacle, and defiance. Though Rome is gone, though the sand is silent, the figure still walks among us, not as a slave, but as an archetype. The man who stood alone, surrounded, bloodied, breathing heavily, waiting for the crowd to choose his fate. He is still here. He lives not in the amphitheater, but in the heart of the myth that never dies. The arena is empty now. The sand has settled into stillness. The gates are rusted shut. The statues have lost their noses, the murals their color, and the names once chanted by thousands now rest, mostly forgotten, in the dust of stone inscriptions. And yet, the gladiator remains, not as a man of blood and steel, but as an idea, as a shadow across centuries, as a heartbeat, still echoing in the quiet spaces between history and myth. In our modern world, so far removed from Rome, so technologically advanced, so ethically altered, the image of the gladiator persists. He appears on film screens, in novels, on stadium walls, in motivational speeches. He is summoned in moments of struggle, when an athlete plays through pain, when a leader stands alone in a storm of opposition, when an individual endures against the odds. We call such people gladiators, and we do so with awe. But why? Perhaps because the gladiator represents something we all understand, the will to stand when it would be easier to kneel, the choice to face suffering instead of fleeing it, the deep, desperate human craving to be seen, truly seen, before time swallows us whole. For the gladiator was never just about combat. His story was not merely about killing or dying. It was about existing in the spotlight for a moment, and in that moment, becoming more than a slave, more than a victim, more than a number. He stood as the embodiment of endurance, physical, yes, but also emotional, spiritual, psychological. He lived in a world where the outcome was not in his hands, but where his dignity was, where he could not choose when he would die, but he could choose how he would die. And so he fought, and the people watched, not only for violence, but for that glimpse of something greater, a man stripped of everything except his will. In this way, the gladiator transcended his time. In ancient Japan, the samurai lived by honor unto death. In medieval Europe, knights jousted for fame and fate. In every age, every culture, humanity has carved out spaces for those who stood at the edge of survival and turned toward it rather than away. We remember the gladiator, not because he was perfect, but because he was human at his most raw. Today, we no longer cheer for blood, but we still hunger for meaning. We still chase the idea that in pain, in trial, in performance, we can become something more than we are. And the gladiator whispers, "You can." He is not gone. He is the runner gasping through the final mile, the surgeon steady in the operating room, the teacher standing tall before a hostile room, the refugee crossing borders, the parent working through the night, the artist exposing a piece of soul to the world. Any person who continues when it would be easier to stop walks the same lonely path. The sand may have changed, but the struggle is the same. And so, in the cracked ruins of Rome, tourists walk where he once fell. Children play games where he once bled. Scholars study his bones, his scars, his armor. Filmmakers reimagine his final breath. But he is more than a lesson, more than a relic. He is a mirror. Because in every age, there are those who fight with everything they have, not for fame, not for gold, not for cheers, but simply for the right to be remembered. And that is the true legacy of the gladiator. He teaches us this, that to stand, to endure, to resist despair, even when everything is taken, is its own kind of victory, and that sometimes even silence can thunder. Bottom of form.